Hello and welcome back. This week for episode 15, I'm joined by Dr. Julia Cooke from the Open University, who is speaking with us about her work and research as a plant ecologist. Julia was an advisor for the recent and successful BBC documentary series Green Planet and describes what it was like working on the show. She also explains her core work involving silicon in plants, which until her research was often overlooked but appears to play a much more significant role than scientists realise. If you like this episode and would like to follow more of Julia's work, please follow the links in the description. And if you'd like to support us, you can make a donation at restoreourplanet.org or follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. Hello, and welcome back to Restore Our Planet podcast with me, your host, Jack Cole. This week, I'm joined by Dr. Julia Cooke, who is a plant ecologist from the Open University, who's going to be discussing our work with her this week with a variety of other things. So, Julia, welcome.
Thank you.
No, thank you for coming. And just to kick things off, would you mind by just explaining to us a little bit about what it is you do and why it's important?
Thanks. So I'm a senior lecturer at the Open University, and I guess in my job I do a mixture of things. So a big part of what we do is teaching, so preparing course material and working with students in environmental science and ecology and those sorts of courses. I'm also a researcher, so doing various projects and trying to understand more about how the world around us works, particularly in the plant world. And then I also have the privilege to work on some Open University BBC co-productions and help facilitate the relationship between academics and these productions. And also in that role, we offer a range of free learning, and I help again facilitate the relationship between academics and the production of these. So from day to day, quite a lot of things.
Fantastic. And tell us a little bit about your journey into your work.
I've always been interested in the natural world. I grew up on a farm in the middle of nowhere in South Australia, and the sort of my parents had bought the farm as a working property, but they weren't farmers. So my dad worked in the city and my mum in the local town. So they took the livestock off and let most of the property regenerate. So lots of the native trees came back, and animals that people hadn't seen for a long time reappeared over 25 years. So that inspired me to be interested in how these interactions between plants and their environment and animals and their environment worked. And so I did a biology degree, mainly interested in plants. And then for some reason I did an arts degree as well, because I was a terrible writer and a terrible speller. So I thought I'll do an arts degree and that will fix that. And interestingly, some of the work I did there really inspired my scientific work and took me in the direction of plant silicon. During my PhD, I started teaching. And I wasn't expecting to be a teacher, but I really love the teaching aspect. And so, although I thought I was going to be a research scientist, I became an academic.
Fantastic. And to be a little bit more specific, what kind of species began returning into your family's plot of farmland?
So being in Australia, lots of eucalypts came up, lots of native pines. We saw orchids reappearing, carpet snakes. Goannas appeared. I think they had a huge bird list after the 25 years. I guess the orchids are probably the one that people hadn't seen around very much. I mean, when you're on a sheep farm, things get eaten, and those sort of small plants don't really make it through. So the sheep and wheat was what was grown in that area predominantly, which isn't really compatible with orchids.
Right. Am I right in saying there's a link between goannas and iguanas?
Is
there something in the name, or are I sort of making that up?
I don't know.
All right.
I have no idea.
Something for homework for afterwards. Something just
Yes.
popped into my head there. I thought there was like some kind of sort of evolutionary link, or no?
I don't know, because I was looking up. There's lots of words for those types of lizards in Australia. There's parenti and monitor and goanna.
Right.
And they all refer to slightly different species. Iguana's South American.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. All right. Sorry, just a bit of a stab in the dark there. But
It's all right.
All right. So you mentioned that you've been working with some BBC projects. Would you mind sort of telling us a little bit about your, of course, quite interesting, exciting one on the Green Planet series?
Yes. So we have the opportunity sometimes to be involved in BBC productions in our role at the Open University. And we're academic consultants to the Open University for the BBC in these programs. And I was absolutely thrilled when Green Planet was first announced and came across my desk, because I love The Private Life of Plants, which was about 25 years ago now. And so in this role, we really try and help realize the producer's vision for the series, really. So the ones that come across my desk obviously are science related, and so the program's commissioned at this point, and people have an idea of what it will look like, but we try to help think what new science discoveries, what new stories might align with what they're thinking about. I think sometimes what can be helpful are things that, having taught in that field, teachers aren't able to find footage of, or things like that, so that things that have never been filmed before, but we know they happen, that kind of thing, we can try and highlight, that they would be very, very welcome. And then we review different parts of the footage in different sort of stages, and there's a bit of fact checking, because in the process of describing things for the audience that the program is aimed at, little bits sometimes can get left out, or we can try and help find better ways to explain things. But of course, the BBC are already very good at what they do, so our role is to enrich as much as we can. But it's wonderful to see how television's made.
Fantastic. Were there any sort of little facts that really surprised you, or anything that stood out from what they were exploring, or some of the little stories there?
Yeah, there were some sort of familiar friends in there, things that I was really pleased to see be presented to such a big audience on primetime television, like the Marimo algal balls that live in freshwater lakes, and the Rafflesia, this giant flower, the biggest flower in the world, that's completely parasitic. Mm-hmm. I think some of the surprising things were stories that sort of challenge what we normally think about. So I think here in the UK, we think about mistletoes as being something that you see in winter up in the tree when all the other leaves have fallen off. You see a big mistletoe. And we think about it at Christmas, but in the Green Planet, they feature a mistletoe that lives inside a cactus, and for most of the year it's sort of hidden inside this cactus, and all of a sudden these flowers burst out, and I think things like that really change people's perception of what a mistletoe is, and I like those sorts of stories.
One that really blew my mind was that Israeli maize, that when it goes to seed, that it basically has a function where it's essentially walking.
Yes.
Until it basically essentially finds a little crack. Absolutely blew my mind, especially when you see that sort of sped up. Over time, you're literally watching a little seed walking along dry earth. Really fantastic. You mentioned there the sorry, I forget the name, but it was the biggest flower in the world.
The Rafflesia.
The Rafflesia, that's the one. Is that the one that basically smells like decay and rot? And tell us a bit about how that flower works.
I've never seen one. I'd love to see one, and I don't study them, but they're such an extraordinary example of plant life. So they're a hollow parasite, which means they have no chlorophyll. They don't make any of their own food with photosynthesis at all. They spend most of their life inside a vine, except when they're ready to flower, and they produce these huge flowers that are a meter across, and they're pollinated by flies that are attracted to carrion or dead animals. So they look like meat and they smell appalling. But yes, to be very unplant-like and make the biggest flower in the world is unbelievable.
Absolutely. Okay, so tell us a little bit about some of your favorite discoveries that have happened over perhaps the past decade or recent years.
I guess there's those that are related to my own research interests, and then there's others that I don't work on at all, but I think are amazing. I think one big area is looking at seagrasses. So these are true plants. So lots of seaweeds and things are not necessarily plants. They're sort of somewhat related perhaps, but quite distant. But seagrasses are true plants that have flowers and seeds and roots. And I think we're learning enormous amounts about those in the last couple of decades. And some of my favorite things that I've learnt are that they're pollinated by animals, just in the same way that land plants are pollinated. So while lots of the flowers release their pollen and they're just carried through the water to land on other flowers and pollinate them, there's also tiny crustaceans that move between the flowers and move the pollen around, just like a bee does on land. And this was sort of shown experimentally just sort of 5 or 6 years ago. And similarly, there's large animals that graze these areas, and we saw that in the Green Planet. So things like dugongs and turtles graze these areas, but they also eat the fruit and the seeds, and they swim away. And then when they deposit their feces, they spread the seed, just like a an antelope or an elephant spread seed. So we see we call them seagrass meadows, and we see lots of the same processes underwater that we see in terrestrial ecosystems. I just think that's mad.
Yeah. It's difficult to imagine sort of pollen sort of functioning the same way in water, because you sort of imagine it just sort of get washed away, or it just somehow disintegrate, or but fascinating.
And I think lots of water plants, or plants that grow either underwater or partly in water, don't even try and spread pollen that way. They stick their flowers above the water and use lots of the kind of terrestrial insects,
dragonflies, bees,
yes. Whereas seagrasses do all of this completely underwater. Amazing.
Brilliant. And is that sort of things that you've been studying personally, or is that just generally what's been interesting over past years?
I think just generally what's been interesting to me. I think seagrasses are gaining interest because of the amount of carbon that's stored in the ecosystems that these areas that form. So there used to be a lot more seagrass meadows than there are now. They're being damaged by fishing and water and sort of nutrient runoff and all sorts of things. But we're realizing that the soil underneath these seagrass meadows can accumulate massive amounts of carbon, which is really what we need at the moment, is to be storing and locking away carbon to reduce the levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide. So seagrasses are gaining interest for that, but at the same time, we're learning a lot about their ecology. And yes, I don't study it. I think I'd like to. Hopefully there's lots of silicon in seagrasses, and I'll get to look.
All right. And what are you studying at the moment? What are you researching?
So I have a couple of projects looking at silicon. So that's my main research interest. And at the beginning, you asked me how I got here, and I was talking about doing an arts degree. And so I have a degree in archaeology and paleontology that I don't really use. But one of the things I learnt was about phytoliths. So when all plants have some silicon in them, and that silicon can be deposited as little tiny silica bodies or plant stones, which is what phytoliths mean. And they can have all sorts of functions in a plant. And then when that plant dies, the organic bit sort of decomposes, like our compost just sort of decomposes. But those tiny little silica bodies or plant stones can hang around in the soil, and we can use those to recreate past environments. So for the kind of paleontology and archaeology component, I was learning about these phytoliths. And then I went looking in the science and the plant literature to see what people knew about plant silicon, and that was very, very little. And so I thought, oh, well, it must be doing something if plants are sort of laying down so much of it. And that sparked my PhD research. And at the moment, one of the things I'm looking at is trying to understand or get closer towards the costs of using silicon for plants. So we're learning that all plants have silicon. They do all sorts of things with it, and it can really help manage a whole range of stresses. but the question is, why don't all plants have loads of silicon if it's so great? There must be a cost.
Right.
And so one of the ways plants take up silicon is through their roots. It's just dissolved in the soil solution. They take it up through the roots, and they can deposit it in their leaves, in around the little pores that open and close.
Stomata?
Yeah,
Stomata?
the stomata.
Is
Yeah,
it?
exactly.
Is it? If I remember correctly, one is when it's open and the other is when it's closed. Is that right? The
I
whole is
think it's,
stoma, or sorry, go
no, I
on.
think it's singular and plural.
Okay. Oh, okay.
So it's
Right.
one stoma and multiple stomata, or maybe the other way around.
Okay.
Um, so it can close, silicon can deposit there and close the stomata, and reduce the transpiration. So we're sort of doing some research to understand what those feedback loops might be, and whether sort of using silicon could be its own worst enemy a little bit.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Hmm.
And sorry, so it serves as a function to give it sort of strength and sort of shape, something like that?
Yes, possibly. So definitely in some plants. So I don't know if you know horse tails. They're or mare's tails. They're some people call them dinosaur plants because there's pictures of these plants, or fossils rather than pictures of these plants, from around dinosaur times and the Carboniferous and things as well. And they have loads of silicon. So they're about 10% of their dry weight is silicon. It's just massive amounts. And people used to use it as sandpaper because it's got so much grit in it. And they're very much use it as a structural component, but it functions. Some grasses use it as a herbivore defense. So it can wear down mouth parts. It can mean when animals are chewing the grass, they can't crush the cells very well because of all these little silica bodies, and so they can't get so much nitrogen. So they go and eat something else instead of these high silicon things.
I think I've also heard you say before that silicon is responsible for like paper cuts. I mean, obviously not paper, but sort of leaf cuts, if we can call it that. Is that accurate?
Yes, I like that, leaf cut.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's where most people encounter silicon. So if you sometimes run your finger up a grass blade and it will give you a little cut, and that's because the edge has silicon. I don't think the plants are trying to hurt your hands. I think they're trying to hurt the kind of the mouth parts of, you know, a cow or a horse or something like that. Yes, the other place people see silicon is in stinging nettles. So when you get stung, that little sting that goes into you is made of silicon.
Oh, really? Because
Exactly.
it's see-through, isn't it? More or less see-through.
Yeah.
Right. Oh, I didn't know that. That's really interesting.
Okay. It turns up everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Nice soup as well. As far as as I've heard, back in the sort of, you know, medieval period, it was quite a common sort of delicacy is the right word, but, you know, just what people generally ate. Okay, that's really interesting. All right, so mentioned a few things there. So what else? What other sort of quite exciting things are going on in your field at the moment?
We're looking at mimicry in plants. So I think a lot more is known about mimicry in the animal world, and understanding how some animals mimic other animals, or they might mimic their behavior. And we see lots of examples of mimicry in the plant world. But to study them and demonstrate mimicry is quite difficult, and we're learning how to do that better in the plant world using examples from animal studies. So in Green Planet, we saw this fantastic example of a what sort of plant was it? It was some sort of sedge, I think, and its seeds had the same shape and sort of texture as antelope dung. And so the dung beetles come along and roll these seeds away and conveniently bury them, mistaking them for animal dung. And so the fact that a plant has evolved to manipulate the visual and, you know, the eyes and the ears of these dung beetles is just extraordinary. To have this kind of confused conversation across these two species is amazing.
And does that generally just come about as a process of evolution, or is that?
Yes, it does. I mean, I think when you see extreme examples of mimicry today, it's really hard to imagine how they might have evolved, because it's such a tight sort of relationship now. But I think probably, there may have been seeds that looked a little bit like these dung and occasionally got rolled away, and the ones that got rolled away obviously grew better. And so, this relationship was strengthened and strengthened and strengthened in terms of how strong the mimicry was. And there's lots of examples of mimicry where flowers might, another example that was in Green Planet was where orchids mimic a female insect, and the male insect tries to mate with the flower, but instead pollinates it. And then in my own work, so we're looking at some of these orchid species and how they mimic insects, because some mimic one insect, which you can see how that might sort of happen, but some attract multiple insects. And how do you mimic multiple insects at the same time? I don't have an answer yet, but I'm asking some questions.
Right, no, fantastic. Well, I suppose another example of mimicry would be, again, I've already forgot the name, the plant that mimics a dead animal. The
Rafflesia.
There we go. Right. Okay.
Yes.
Rafflesia. I won't forget it again. Rafflesia.
I think it was named after Raffles, who was an explorer.
Oh, right. Of course. Oh, brilliant.
That helps.
Okay. So there we go. Okay. So what changes would you like to see in your field over the coming years, or is there anything you wish there was more of emphasis on supporting that would potentially, assist our wider society in some way or other?
That's a good question. I guess one of the big, well, I don't know if it's sort of an internal problem or an external problem, is when we do science, it's nice to discover things and find things, but then a really important part is communicating them to other people, whether that's the science community or further afield. And a lot of that work occurs through journals. So we publish our work in peer-reviewed journals. So you write up your report and you submit it, and then it goes out for review, and then the journal accepts it or not accepts it, and it's hopefully it's eventually published. And that process is part of the kind of the sort of maintaining scientific rigor. But the kind of publication model is a bit sort of broken. So all the peer reviewing is done by peers, but you essentially do that work for free. So you can sort of do it as part of your job, but often there's not time. So it's a lot of work that we do, often out of hours. And then there's also often big fees involved in publishing your work and where it can be published. And then to access, if you're not part of an institution, to access that work, you often have to pay to read those articles. So I think there's sort of these bottlenecks and problems associated with. Yes, it's sort of people, there are barriers to publication because it's those who can afford to publish in certain places that makes it unfair. And then having done that work, it's not available to everybody, and it's the people that can pay that can have access. I was
about to say, it really sort of disincentivizes outsiders or sort of genius eccentrics who have come from like a different sort of marginalized background or something like that. There's a lot of barriers, I imagine.
And I think people who different universities can afford different access to journals for their students and things like that. So there's that system to me is not fair. I mean, there's all sorts of journals. There's journals where you pay to publish, but then they're free to read. There's journals where it's free to publish, but you pay to read. There's journals where these things are highly subsidized. There's sort of a full spectrum of journals from very good to really bad. But the whole system, I think, is problematic because we need it to be more accessible, both for publication and reading rather than less. So if I could change one thing about being part of science, it would be that.
Now, how do you think that would come about? Would it be just a complete overhaul of the sort of the culture of publishing research, or?
Yeah, I don't have a good solution really, because obviously it needs to be funded somehow, because these are organizations that have editors and platforms for organizing the peer review process, and typesetters, and sometimes physical publications or electronic publications, and storage of all of those sorts of things. So it's not something that can be free and just happen.
Sure.
But whether they're sort of need to be non-profit organizations that are running them, whether once it's published, putting other versions in other places should be more acceptable and legalized. I don't know. There's lots of different models flying around at the moment that people are trying, and hopefully become more equal. And I think too, it's those in sort of powerful positions who start boycotting some journals and making some of those changes. And it's the people who with less power who can't, who don't really have a choice. So I think we can all make a contribution by deciding where we publish and where we review.
Right, and who people choose to read, and sort of respect generally, I suppose. Yeah.
Indeed.
Okay. Well, right. How about what excites you about the coming years in plant ecology?
A lot.
Yeah, please elaborate.
I think in my own field in plant silicon research, it's been magic to watch a community grow. So when I was first a PhD student and I went to a conference, I said, I work on plant silicon. People said, plant what? Plants have silicon in them. And now when I go to a conference, sometimes there's a session on plant silicon, and there's a lot of people working in this area now. It's still quite small, but I think it's really interesting and growing. And it's great to see new PhD students coming through and all of the wonderful things that they're doing, and helping them and pay it forward in the way of people have supported me. So there's lots of interesting ways to study plant silicon. One of the nice things that has come up recently is somebody studying a chronosequence. So it's an area where you get a range of different soil ages. So these are really new soils that have recently weathered from rocks and things, and then slightly older and slightly older and slightly older and slightly older. Well, slightly being millions of years older, I suppose. And then you can this area might experience similar climate. So you can rule out climate as there's no climate variation across the site. So it must be the soil. And these soils have different amounts of silicon, and then you can study the vegetation and see how that changes over time. So rather than, because we haven't got a time machine and we can't go back in time, we can sort of look at this chronosequence, which I think is just such an elegant approach to doing studies. There's also students looking at silicon in different groups of plants. So a lot of the focus has been on grass because they have quite a bit of silicon in them, and rice and sugarcane and wheat and barley and things are really important crops and also contain a lot of silicon. So those grasses have had a lot of the attention, and there's students coming up that are arguing that other plant groups need our attention. And there's, for example, looking at legumes and all the beans and peas and that family, and they're really important crops as well, but they're also interesting because they have a relationship with bacteria. And so these bacteria are housed in their roots in these nodules, and they can fix nitrogen. So they can take nitrogen from the air and fix that from a gas to various compounds and help fertilize the soil. So people advocating for more studies to look at silicon and how that might have a role in legumes or the beans and pea family.
All right, fantastic, exciting. Okay, Julia. Well, thank you for the wonderful conversation so far. Just to end things, where can people find your work and follow you in general?
Well, if you Google Julia Cooke and the Open University, I'll turn up somewhere. And I'm on Twitter at Cooke Julia, and that's Cooke with an E.
Fantastic. Julia, thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome.